I still remember the first time I saw information about Final Fantasy VI. It was in the October 1994 issue of Nintendo Power. When I first saw the game, I was disappointed. Coming off of the more traditional fantasy-based Final Fantasy IV, known to me as Final Fantasy II at the time, Final Fantasy VI looked like it was leaning into a more futuristic and technological setting, and I was very worried that I wasn't going to like it. It seemed so different than the first games I had played at the time. Thankfully, this didn't stop me from buying the game when I was younger, though. It turned out to be a game that I really enjoyed and probably wound up playing more than Final Fantasy IV growing up. Question is, as always, does it hold up today? It's something I always worry about when replaying older games that I enjoyed. So let's take a look at how Final Fantasy VI fares in that regard. Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster is a turn-based RPG developed by Square Enix. It was released in 2022 for PC and mobile, and was later released in 2023 for the PS4 and Nintendo Switch. Final Fantasy VI was originally released in 1994, and I played the PS4 version for this review. Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster is $17.99 on all platforms, and for a rating, Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster has a T rating. And while Final Fantasy VI is a bit darker than some of the previous entries, it doesn't really seem like it warrants a T, to me at least. I feel like Final Fantasy VI is where the series really starts to blossom when it comes to story and character development. Final Fantasy IV and V both started to have fleshed out characters that were distinct and developed those characters over the course of the story. Final Fantasy VI really leans into that, having a wide cast of characters that all have unique personalities, and most have unique story arcs that really help make the cast feel more fully fleshed out and a part of the world around them. It is also a story that can be a bit hard to define without giving too many spoilers. I know that this is a 30-year-old game at this point, but I still don't like giving too much about the game away. The main reason that this game is a little bit hard to define in terms of story is that the game is kind of divided into two parts. While these are very much connected, the main emphasis of the two halves aren't exactly the same. The first half starts with three people in mechanical suits called Magitech armor, heading toward the town of Narshe to find an Esper, a magical creature that was rumored to have been discovered there. Two of these are soldiers, and the third is a young woman who's able to use magic herself, but is being controlled by these soldiers in the Empire that they're a part of. It is after this initial setup that we see the memorable scene of these three marching through the snow in order to get to Narshe. It's such an interesting and memorable opening that really sticks with you, even though really there's not a lot happening in it. But it sets this tone of this more pensive game that you maybe weren't expecting from a Final Fantasy game. Now, the mission goes south as the Esper reacts strangely to this woman. This reaction causes the soldiers to be killed and all three of the Magitech armors to be destroyed. The woman awakens in the home of Arvis, who had found her, but the woman can't really remember anything but her name, which is Terra. These events lead Terra to be placed into the midst of a conflict between the Empire, who was controlling her, and the Returners, an organization trying to fight against the Empire in its attempt to take over the world. And this makes up the main focus of the first half of the game. You're the rebel group taking on the big evil Empire. Things shift a little as you enter the second half of the game, because there's events in that first half that kind of really change the trajectory of the story. But I'm not going to go too much into details about what that exactly is. Most likely many of you have heard, but I don't want to spoil it for those who maybe haven't. What is super interesting about the story of Final Fantasy VI is that there is no clearly defined main character. Terra seems like she should be, as she's the character you start with and also in the logo for the game. And I would say that this is very true in the first half of the game, as Terra is very much in the center of the events going on. But I feel like she kind of fades out of that spotlight in the second half of the game. She's still an important character, but the focus isn't as much on her. Now, in part, I think this lack of a main character is just because the cast of Final Fantasy VI is so very strong, and so many of them have important storylines throughout the game. You are able to get up to 14 different characters to join your party over the course of the game. Like any cast this large, there are some that are developed far more than others. Between the path of the narrative and the large cast, it is kind of hard to pick out a clear main character. The best arguments are probably for Terra or Celes, which is really interesting because there really hasn't been a female lead in any of the Final Fantasy games so far. But there are other characters like Edgar, Sabin, and Locke that are strong forces in the narrative as well. Now, I really enjoyed the narrative here. It's a game filled with interesting characters, villains that you love to hate. Kefka is often mentioned in many a top villains list, and just a sense of a world that changes over time. While it may not be as impressive compared to more recent games, this game was super revolutionary at the time. It also still holds the record for the most playable characters among the mainline Final Fantasy games. The story also felt a bit darker overall compared to previous games. Previous games have all had serious moments and times of loss and sadness, but the tone of the story here always felt a bit more melancholy and subdued. There is humor, of course, but the ideas of military occupation, world domination, genocide, the idea of having to kind of fight to survive some really harsh events, and just other kind of heavier themes of loneliness and giving up hope and things like that are just within this story makes it feel a lot different than many of the Final Fantasy games before it. It feels less like this grand adventure and more of a constant struggle to overcome the odds placed in front of you. This may turn people off from the narrative, but I really enjoyed this actually. To me, it felt like a really good mix of humor and seriousness that presented a harsh but hopeful world. In terms of base gameplay, Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster doesn't really deviate much from the other Final Fantasy games in the Pixel Remaster Collection. Final Fantasy VI is still a turn-based RPG that uses the active time battle system introduced in Final Fantasy IV. It still has an overworld map filled with locations to explore and random encounters to battle. As usual, you have various locations like towns, caves, dungeons, mountains, and other places to explore over the course of the game. Armor, weapons, accessories, and items can be purchased at the towns, while the other areas often have enemies to fight and treasure to find along the way. The Pixel Remaster also has the same additions that the others in the series have had as well. These range from presentation options like font styles, a CRT filter option, and a selection of either a remastered soundtrack or the original. There are also a bunch of additional options like the ability to run, a bestiary, boosts to increase experience, money, or ability points for learning spells. There is also the ability to quick save at any location without needing a save spot. If you've played any of the other Pixel Remasters, you kind of know what to expect here. These are the things that are similar, but Final Fantasy VI does have some unique gameplay aspects as well. The first that you'll notice is that Final Fantasy VI follows in the tradition of Final Fantasy IV in making each character linked to a job of sorts, even though they're often quite different than many of the traditional Final Fantasy jobs. Like Terra is a Magitech elite, Locke is an adventurer, which functions like a thief, just don't let him hear you say that. Edgar is a machinist, and Sabin is a monk, and so on. This means that everyone has certain equipment that is specified for them, and that they also have unique abilities that only they can use. Locke can steal, Edgar can use tools like drills and chainsaws in combat, Sabin can use the Blitz ability to use various martial arts techniques, and so on. While some of these abilities are more useful than others, I do really like how this made every character feel unique. I really like when games do this because I think that it adds so much personality to the game. I like it a lot better than whenever a game can kind of make all the characters feel too similar by adding all kinds of like the customization options. It's kind of one of the things I struggle with the job system is because, well, everybody can learn pretty much the same thing, so you just kind of wind up making things not as distinct necessarily. Another different aspect of Final Fantasy VI is how magic works. In previous entries in the series, you were able to learn magic in one of two ways. In most of the games, you learned it by purchasing the magic at stores. The only exception to this was Final Fantasy IV, when only certain characters could use magic and they learned their spells when they hit certain character levels. Final Fantasy VI goes for a completely different method. Partway through the game, you'll be able to get access to Magicite. Magicite is basically the remains of a deceased Esper that still holds their soul and their power. Each different Magicite will teach different magic at different rates of learning. Rama, for example, teaches 3 spells: Thunder at 10 times the AP earned in battle, Thundara at 2 times the AP learned in battle, and Poison at 5 times. This can be a bit of a grind with some of the harder to learn spells that only have like 1 times, but I found turning on boosts for learning spells to be very helpful here and kind of eliminated a lot of that grind for me. To learn the spells, you have to equip the Magicite to a character. When you have a Magicite equipped, you are also able to summon that particular Esper in combat for various effects. There are also certain Magicite that give your characters a extra boost whenever they level up, like +1 to magic or 10% extra HP. This combo of learning spells and gaining stat bonuses can really help you shape your party how you kind of want it to look like. Magic is also divided up a bit differently than previous games. Instead of black and white magic, magic is split into attack, healing, and support magic. While attack and healing have these same colored orbs associated with their old categories, white for healing and black for attack, support has a gray sphere next next to the spell's name, there are also a couple other minor gameplay additions here as well. The first is that the accessories introduced in Final Fantasy V are called relics here, and you are able to equip 2 of them. These can do a variety of things like protect you from negative status effects, grant you positive status effects, boost your stats, change battle commands, for example turning steel to mug, as well as altering aspects of walking in the field, like reducing random encounter chances. Finding the right relics to build your characters can be quite enjoyable as you create a super strong fighter or powerful magic user. There are also times that you are able to split your party into multiple groups in order to face a particular challenge or explore certain dungeons that require some puzzle solving along multiple routes. While these times can be a bit challenging due to the need to keep more than just your favorite characters leveled up and developed, I found this to be a good use of the large cast you're given. It makes you feel like the whole party is truly involved in some of the bigger moments of the game. Overall, I thought that the gameplay of Final Fantasy VI was amazing. It builds off the already solid foundation of the Final Fantasy series, and the additions it brings to the table are very good. If I had to give any aspect a bit of criticism, it is the Magicite system. It can make the game grindy without boosts, and if you do boost or do the grind, it can make your characters a bit too similar potentially. While some characters might still be stronger attacking or using their particular skill, many will just be able to spam Ultima and win any battle in their way. At the same time, the beauty of a game like this is that it has the kind of customization that allows you to kind of do what you want and develop your characters how you see fit. You don't want certain characters to learn magic so that they can just focus on their unique skills? Go ahead. Want to cap levels so your party doesn't get too strong? You can stop the XP gain in the boost system. The systems here allow for a lot of possible variety. Not as much as with Final Fantasy V and the job system, but much more than, say, Final Fantasy IV. This makes for a game that is super enjoyable and one that you can play however you want to, at least within the systems presented. Final Fantasy VI is really the pinnacle of the SNES era for art style. Pretty much every aspect of the game is improved from the previous entries. Sprites are larger, more detailed, and able to be more expressive. Environments are detailed and beautiful. Even some of the things like the overworld and the battle backgrounds are much improved in Final Fantasy VI. Now there are some things that kind of stay the same, like enemy sprites. They continue to look great. If I had to say one aspect of the art style that hasn't aged quite as well, it's probably the Mode 7 parts when you're flying the airship. I think it is still better than the old ways of airship flying, but it just wasn't quite as impressive as I remember it being when I first played the game on the SNES. I think the details while in this mode just look a little off, which just kind of makes it seem a little odd feeling when you're doing it. Maybe that's just me on that, but I just didn't think it looked quite as nice as the rest of the game overall. Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack continues a tradition of great Final Fantasy music. There are so many memorable songs in this game, and this starts from the very beginning with the ominous music on the title screen and continues through all aspects of the game. From the various character themes to the various location themes, everything just stands out beautifully and fits the characters and locations so very well that you can't help but connect them in your head every time you hear the music. I could go on and on, but Final Fantasy VI has an amazing soundtrack that I very much enjoy. It's a memorable one, and it's really hard to find too bad of a song on it. As always, the sound effects are also very good in the game, but I feel like with the Final Fantasy series, the soundtracks just always stand out far more than the sound effects of the game. Final Fantasy VI is the culmination of the Final Fantasy series up to this point. I feel like the storytelling and character development is some of the best in the series in general, let alone up to this point. The gameplay creates the feeling of playing distinct characters while also providing customization options as well with relics and Magicite. While the Magicite system can be a bit of a grind, this can be mitigated with the boosts provided by the Pixel Remaster version. I also feel that the art style is very much at its highest point here as well. Sound is maybe a bit more debatable in my mind, as really all three of the SNES era of games have an amazing soundtrack, and I'd say particularly Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI, which are a couple of my favorites. With that all said, I'm rating Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster a 10 out of 10. There is a reason that this entry is held up as one of the best RPGs, not just of the SNES era, but of all time. It may be a game pushing 30, but it still holds up amazingly well today. I'm so glad that my younger self was wrong when I first saw the information about this game. My worries were ill-founded. Final Fantasy VI may be a bit more bleak and a little less high fantasy than some of its predecessors, but it was and is an amazing game that is worth checking out.